Greetings once again. This is Noah Fredericks coming to you from our series we've entitled Pilgrim Ships. The chapter that we're going to be dealing with today we've entitled Jonah's UFO. Unfortunately, we find that there's a very large percentage of the religious world, or just among the average people, they throw up an invisible wall of defense if you were to mention the history or the records of what they consider heathen nations. If they would only research the great preponderance of evidence cited in these ancient documents, they would find that there's a great historical parallel confirming the accounts given in their present-day Bible, even more clear on the subject. That you'll find a lot of these ancient documents, they're not tampered with by what I call the priestcraft of the Western man. And haven't we all sang songs about the Ancient of Days and I am yesterday, today, and forever if you've gone to one of these little country churches? I would like to point out to you some interesting things that you'll find in what a lot of people refer to as the Egyptian Book of the Dead. But there are many what I consider intriguing phrases such as the Ancient of Days, the Sons of Darkness, Spirits of Light, Legions in the Sky. Then they're termed like hidden gods, deities in the divine eye. The Bible speaks of watchers, they speak of winged discs and flying shields. And then they go on and they quote one that's called the Boast of Horus. I, Horus, I am yesterday, I am tomorrow, and I cruise through space and time. Was this an idle boast, or was it a clue to a scientific shortcut through space? I feel that for many years people talked to me about time travel, where you could travel back in time and you could travel ahead into the future, and we've all heard the stories about how long it takes the light to travel from a star to our planet Earth, measuring in millions of light years. And a lot of times they tell us that the light that is just now reaching us, that planet is already dead and burned out. Well, this gives me mental indigestion. I have trouble thinking along these lines because I'm not scientific-minded enough, or do I have the background and learning in some of these areas that I could refute it or just whatever. But I have been puzzled by many places in the Bible where John, the book of Revelation, and other things, where these men were able to see into the future, and they spoke in the first person. They spoke as if it were happening, as they were witnessing an accident at an intersection. Well, the religious world, they get around that by saying the Lord gave them a vision. But I don't know as I can accept that in its entirety. I just wonder if these people back in antiquity, did they step into one of these ships that could go through the curve of time and space that our scientists spoke of and actually see these events happening, say, in our time or throughout different generations? Well, it's something to keep in the back of our mind. We find that our scientists, they say space and time is curved. They also give many accounts of flying submarines, many times described as flying rolls or cigar-shaped, that can travel underwater as well as on space. Now, we're still referring back to these ancient Egyptian accounts and the interpretations of the hieroglyphics found on the walls of a lot of the great Egyptian pharaohs, such as Tutankhamun and so forth, and we find carvings on their sarcophagus, and from the Egyptian Book of the Dead and many accounts. They show us things that I can't understand why man hasn't exposed them before now. But I think in this generation of Star Wars and satellites in the sky and shooting our space shuttles out there, that this is now the time that man is able to open his mind and to reconsider these ancient accounts. For we find that many of these accounts, they dwarf the Bible and the book and the fictional accounts of this recent popular movie called The Red Dawn, about one of their nuclear submarines. And we think, my, isn't that marvelous? But we find that the ancients, they even had more advanced weapons, which we are yet, what I would say, to reinvent. The Book of the Dead, it tells of celestial wars in the heavens, as does Revelation, the 12th chapter of our Bible, and Job, and many other of the prophetic accounts of these ancient men of old. And we find the old Chinese classics. They also tell of sun discs that could flash beams of light at the fiery dragon ships in their accounts of the battles of gods of space and earth and under the sea. Allow me now, if you would, to quote from an ancient account given by an Egyptian. And it goes like this. Stretched forth on the flank of the mountain sleeps the great serpent, 180 feet long, 50 feet broad, its belly adorned with scintillating flints and stones. Now I know the name of the serpent of the mountain. Now isn't this odd? He starts out, he's talking about something that appears to be on a mountain, or in the ancient term, like the Hebrew, something high up, and I choose to believe the translators misinterpreted this, thinking it meant a mountain instead of something high up. It goes on to say, behold, it is he who dwells in the flames. After navigating in silence, Ra darts a glance at the serpent. Suddenly his navigation stops, as though he is hidden in his bark, awaits in bushes. I believe that we'll find here that he's referring to his bark as referring to a type of underground ship. And when it talks about that he waits in ambush, that he's beneath the sea. Going on to quote further now, he says, behold, he dives into the water and is seen submerged 40 feet deep. He assails Set, launching at him his javelin of steel. We find that this above account was given by this ancient Egyptian as speaking of a duel between two spaceships, or one or both, and they had the ability to submerge and navigate under the water. Found this quote from a book that comes out of France, Boncompagni, Solas, S-O-L-A-S. We have this in our library if anybody would care to question this, and we cover in greater detail in Job's account. He told of submarines way back in the days of antiquity, and he prophesied, I believe, of nuclear submarines that will be in the latter days in which we're now dwelling in. I think you'll find that very informative. And he told of ancient and possibly referring to future warfare, which, as we find, is laughed at by the Almighty. Was this the Ra that the Egyptians talked about? They believed in one God, but they had other gods, which they referred to as the sons of Ra, and the Hebrews called him Yahweh. But yes, we find it very significant, Ish-Ra-El, and we find that Ra used in the middle of it. There's a point that we must make at this time to try to clear things up, that there are so many different forms of prejudice, meaning to judge a matter or a thing without first hearing the evidence. So that's what you call prejudice. So many times modern man, he used labels and sayings and even archaeological evidence as old silly superstitions. They're myths to him. This is a cop-out, I believe, that's used many times, unfortunately, by the religious and also the scientific communities. Take, for example, now, the reason I'm going to give this next example is because we think this is fictitious, we think that it's ridiculous, and this could never possibly have been. But if the listener will bear with me, I believe that we can prove our point. Allow me to cite to you the example of the stone goddess of Diana of Ephesus, which showed that she had 12 or more bared breasts. The religious will say that this was part of some ancient phallic cult started by some oversexed priest. Well, there's another more ancient goddess who was called Sybil, who also was depicted and looked very much the same matter, same way, let's say. And then we have the fish god, which ancient historical records tells us was Dagon. He was much revered in Nineveh and all the other ancient worlds, from darkest Africa to the remotest regions of every Asian nation. We find that She was revered, or these Dagon people, I mean to say, in Egypt and Babylon and so forth, and they were reported by all to be gods who descended from space, and that they brought earthmen great science and knowledge, quite possibly true, and many of the teachings they brought were beneficial. But we also say that many of them apparently were diametrically opposed, as the north is to the south, from the teaching of the God of the Hebrew people. The people that we cited were those that came in the Shem ships and the Israel God of Jonah. Now let's say that this ancient queen with 12 breasts and men with gills like fish that could breathe underwater. It's ridiculous, we would say, but we who breathe there, we are actually a phenomenon which we take for granted, as fish cannot breathe liquid water when it's frozen. We cannot breathe air that is frozen when it reaches a certain point. And the Bible that we have in our nation here, it tells us that all flesh is not the same flesh. There's the flesh of man, the flesh of beast, the flesh of cattle, the flesh of fish, and etc. Now, if we use the word evolution, this disturbs a lot of the religious, as some teach it. And I find that as evolution is taught, I find it disruptive. I find it in error, because I believe in science and I believe in a creator and a master of all this, but we'll leave it at that. But when a man and a woman comes together, we find that the sperm of two single cells, each coming together, the baby has or goes through stages as it's formed. It starts out with a tail like a tadpole. It has gills like a fish, has 12 teats like a female dog, and is both male and female, going through these stages until this newly formed creature that we call a baby decides what sex it will develop into. And it seems that man, being the highest, let's say, on the chain of the animal kingdom, he goes through all of these stages of the beast creature that he is supposed to be ruling over in righteousness. Now, this does not take away from God or man being God's son, but it shows that there's a basic building blocks here that are common to all nature. And this is called a science of ontogeny, recapitulation, phenology, and it's called Haeckel's biogenetic law. These are things that we cannot build anything without going through them. And I believe if you'll go and talk to some of the surgeons who have gone in, performed operation removing some women's extra breasts and so forth, this is more common that we know, but it's not talked about. This does not mean that man evolves from germs that crawl up on the beach. The point is that every woman that's born today, that there are still, what I'm trying to say, there's still women today that are born with 12 or even less breasts. It still occurs today. But something like that, you don't go broadcasting. So where these Dagon people, they said that they had gills and tails, they were a hybrid, or were they possibly a, excuse me, a genetic experiment that went awry? Or were they designed by the Creator to survive on strange planets that we cannot conceive? Or were they just freaks of nature that was worshipped by the ancient people because of their science and their awesome accounts? We will find that one of the strangest that was worshipped by the ancient people because of their science and their awesome accounts. Parallels in the history book of examples of extraterrestrial intervention called the Bible occurs here between Christ and Jonah. Jonah is one of the smaller books. It's called one of the minor prophets, so-called. But the feat that he was to accomplish was not considered minor by him, nor would it be by you. Let's say if you had been in his shoes. It is one of the least read and least understood books in the Bible. One of the reasons today it is avoided because it does not make sense to a lot of the thinking persons. And you would never get a scientific person to buy the story of a whale swallowing a man. Now, most whales you'll find in studying in school that that they live on a microscopic plankton, which they filter between their teeth. Let's say it was a killer whale, which might chew you up and swallow you. Let's say he swallowed you whole. That seems impossible, but those who quote the scripture to us, they say he did. Now, do you believe that a man could survive the stomach acids for 3 days and 3 nights and also without air? But we find that Christ himself referred back that Jonah was going to be a sign that he was going to give that generation of his time in the area that he lived in. But a lot of those people, unfortunately, never did understand what he was talking about because they didn't know the ancient books of Israel. They had diverted to other religions and philosophies. So we find that there's something radically wrong here in this story of Jonah that has been presented to us. They may have swallowed this story hook, line, and sinker, if you'll forgive the pun, a few centuries ago, but not in our day of marine lands throughout our country, and people are a little wiser. Jonah, he received a message, so the story goes, from the ever-living with orders that he was to go to Nineveh. And to get there, he was to go and tell them that they were to turn from their wicked ways or he'd destroy the city. This is the Almighty that sent him, this great space lord. Till about the last century, the scientists and archaeologists, they considered that Nineveh was nothing more than a mythical city, and Jonah's tale was nothing but a fable. See, again, like the Greeks. Jonah was a real person. The Amplified Bible footnotes on page 1040 says Jonah was a historical character, not fictional, and it is evidenced beyond question by the references to him in 2 Kings 14th chapter and the 25th verse. It tells us that Jeroboam, he restored the borders of Israel according to the word of the Yahweh, which he spoke by his servant Jonah, the son of Amittai, which means Matthew, the prophet, which came from Gath-hepher. In spite of the fact that 3 times in the Old Testament, Genesis 10, 11, and 12, Jonah 1, 2, and 3, 3, and once in the Apocrypha, a book called Judith, mentioned in the 1st chapter and the 1st verse, we find that Nineveh was called a great city. Now, these Bible skeptics, that critics have long believed that this is an erroneous statement. It's been greatly exaggerated, but then we find that the walled city of Nineveh, when it was first excavated, it was found to be less than 9 miles in circumference. There were claims that the author of Jonah's book, Jonah himself, did not know what he was talking about. Later on, the archaeologists, they later found excavations that proved that Nineveh had many suburbs, including 3 which were mentioned in Genesis 10, 11, and 12. And we find that one first century writer, Diodorus Siculus, justifiably said Nineveh was a quadrangle measuring about 60 miles in circumference. A great city indeed, wouldn't you say? Now, Jonah in 4:11, he tells us that there were more than 120,000 people who are not yet old enough to know their right hand from their left. Now, this was just speaking of children. I think it was speaking of small children. And Farrar Fenton in Jonah 3:3 tells us that Nineveh was a great city of God. Did that mean that there were many of the Hebrew children of Israel living there whom he wanted to return to him? Now we can see what a scary task was facing our hero Jonah. And you would have to admit that would make your liver quiver. In the book of Jonah, that we found in the book of Judith, I mean to say, that we found the Apocrypha, it tells of a great city government and how powerful Nineveh was. Then you'd understand why Jonah got on a ship going in the opposite direction. Then he went the way that he did not go the way that he was told to go. That would be like the Almighty send you to Russia and order you to go over there and tell them to give up communism and turn to Christianity or Judaism. Wouldn't you bug out? So in its day, Nineveh was renowned for science and astronomy that actually led the world. Today we're discovering through history and archaeology because he was performing advanced, believe this or not, brain surgery on many of his afflicted patients. And we find our own version of the X-ray was not discovered until 1895. We look around at the different plundered libraries, lost scrolls, and ancient maps of the old sea kings and sky kings, and they tell of flying machines and dead cities, and they tell of UFOs and sightings throughout all the ages, and they speak of these weird aerial demons who would keep hanging up their anchors on some church steeple. We have accounts of telescopes and X-ray devices that seem to be out of time and place. Nobody seems to know all the answers, but we're beginning to look at the puzzles and we're asking new questions. We find that the astronomical science of the Chaldeans, who had telescopes, they had the knowledge of the properties of naphtha or native petrol among the initiates of Asia Minor. Other authors, they mention the discoveries in the ruins of Nineveh, objects in every respect similar to electric batteries, and Houghton, and I'll break it down into the English there, and what he would call the lost civilizations of the continents. He spoke of many of these things. There's quite a number of other men that brought this evidence forth. We will discover in ancient texts precise information to the fact that certain ancestral industries had been established among men as a result of information that was supplied by these visitors from other worlds. It was not their scientific knowledge that upset the ever-living from beyond the stars. It was the rejection of him and his laws and his orders. There is much speculation as to what went on in Nineveh and who was responsible for messing things up in town, let's say. Who established Nineveh, and why was the Almighty interested in the great city? Was it because that there was thousands of Israelites that were living there, and were they being led away from the God of Moses, and that they were cohabitating with these people from other nations that was prohibited? And were they being led away to the strange gods? You may want to go read Deuteronomy, 7th chapter, 3rd and the 4th verse. Now that we go on, we try to find out who was it that started this city, and who was it they looked up to, and who were the kings, because it seemed to have lasted several centuries there, and we can only guess at some of the history, but we find that some claim that it was Ninus, who was supposed to be Nimrod. If you read a book that I have in my library, it's entitled Aid to Bible Understanding. Also, there's another quite interesting book that's called The Two Babylons. And the question is, who was this historical Bel, B-E-L, as he was sometimes spoke of? He must have been Cush, for we find that Cush, he begot Nimrod. You find this in Genesis 10:8. And Cush is generally represented as having been a ringleader and a great apostasy, whatever this was. But again, Cush, he was the son of Ham, or Hermes, or Mercury, for Hermes is just an Egyptian synonym for the son of Ham. Now Hermes, he was the great original prophet of idolatry, and he was recognized by the pagans as being the author of their religious rites and the interpreter of God. Now we look at the name of Belus, B-E-L-U-S, or Bel, was given to the father of Ninus or Nimrod. In connection with this, we find the Greek term Belus. It represented both the Baal and the Bel of the Chaldees. There were two entirely different distinct titles, which are both alike and often given to the same god. But Bel, he signified the confounder. It is proven that Belus, the father of Ninus, was that he had built or founded Babylon. There is a very distinct allusion to this found in Jeremiah 1 and 2 when we read that Belus confounded, that he is the confounder, is brought to confusion. Cush was known to pagan antiquity under the very character of Bel, B-E-L. Also, they worshipped a god known as Dagon, which the Greeks changed to Neptune, or the god of the ocean. There's a book called one of the lost books of the Bible, the lost book of Thomas, and in there Christ himself, he apparently refers to Neptune, and he realized the people worshiped the god that lived under the ocean. Now, where did they come up with such stories as somebody living under the ocean? That's nonsensical. And that's somewhere back in the shadows of antiquity, they realized and understand that there was submarines, giant submerged cities. Well, let's just hang on to that for a while. We'll get into this in other chapters. Now, as we quote from the footnotes of the Two Babylons by the Reverend Alexander Hyslop, page 215, he tells us that Dagon, the fish god of the Philistines and the Babylonians, there were two ways in which Dagon was anciently worshipped and represented. The one was when he was depicted as half man and half fish, the upper part of him being entirely human, the under part ending in the tail of a fish. The other was when he used the words of Layard. The head of the fish formed a mitre above that of the man, while its scaly fan-like tail, it fell as a cloak behind, leaving the human limbs and feet exposed. And I believe this is more believable and plausible. Dagon is a later name for the god Tammuz, Tammuz, or Nimrod. It could have been vice versa, but he find that it was he who was spoken of in other chapters while quoting mysteries of the Babylonian religion that came out of the plains of Shinar and was started by none other than Nimrod, called by those and other names which was carried over into Nineveh. Later on we're going to get into more detail. We find out that the plains of Shinar is a mistranslation, and in the original text it was bushland. And I believe that we can prove and show that these people were speaking of ancient worlds and civilizations that had come to us, to this planet. And we believe that Dagon is the same, now spelled D-A-G-O-N, is the same as the Dogon, D-O-G-O-N. People of today, we believe that their knowledge in science and astronomy, that they claim of charts and maps to the highways of the stars, which were brought to them and their understanding by the travelers from beyond the stars, call themselves Dagon or Dogon people. Studying Zechariah the 5th chapter about the extraterrestrial women who corrupted earthmen, Jude, Revelation, Genesis, include earthmen who were corrupted by intergalactic demons, as they call them. We believe from evidence that Nineveh had Israelites, and they had other races represented there in that great city, and they were being corrupted by erroneous teachings, or let's call it an evil religion as viewed by the Israelites and by Jonah. We'll see that Jonah was sent there to get them to follow the righteous laws of the Hebrew God Yahweh. We see what a great task Jonah had ahead of him. No wonder he got on a ship going in the wrong direction. What was the strange parallel between the Christ referring back to Jonah? Jonah's mentioned about 9 times approximately in your New Testament. Matthew 12:39 tells that Jonah is to be a sign, surely a type of resurrection, but how, where, and who played a part in all of this? It also implies divine intervention. Let's see, how did they come, and in what, and from where? And if our assumption is correct, then this was repeated at Christ's death and resurrection. How was Christ restored to life? We have other chapters that are going to deal with this. We find in Luke 11:29-30 gives us a clue as to future events, telling us that Jonah was a sign. Luke 11:32 tells us that people repented at the preaching of Jonah. Now, how did they repent at Christ's preaching? Quote from Friar Fenton, Luke 11:29-32, he speaks of a sign. We do not understand that there were several facets to this sign. And it's rather strange that we find that the verses that we've quoted here, that the Friar Fenton, he titles it Jonah and the Queen of the South as examples. Then the crowd was densely collected around him. He began to say, this generation is depraved. It seeks for a sign. No sign shall be granted, except to the sign of the prophet Jonah. For as Jonah was a sign to the Ninevites, so also shall the Son of Man be to this race. The Queen of the South shall rise up against the men of this generation in the judgment, and they shall condemn them. For she came from the extremities of the earth to listen to the philosophies of Solomon, and yet a greater than Solomon is here. Men from Nineveh shall stand up in the judgment against this race and shall convict it, because they were converted by the preaching of Jonah. But now a greater than Jonah is here. It is this author's opinion that Christendom has never understood the idea that if nations do not heed the example of Jonah and the Christ and turn back the Almighty's way of doing things, they will encourage the wrath of great extraterrestrial armies and invasions, possibly in our day. There doesn't seem to be any answers on this earth. Jonah was mentioned as a messenger of the Most High, and he was told to rise and go to Nineveh. And next we find that Jonah, he was on board the ship. The first clue comes as he acknowledged that he blew his assignment in Jonah 1 and 4, the Farrar Fenton version. But the Lord sent out a great wind into the sea, and there was a mighty tempest in the sea, so that the ship was like to be broken. That's odd, a great wind into the sea. Remember Elijah's servant? He spoke of a cloud coming up out of the sea. We find that in the Farrar Fenton's version, the center notes, it refers to Hosea 13 and 15, and an east wind shall come, the wind of the Lord, and etc. And it goes on to say that, let's refer you first to Ezekiel's prophecy in Ezekiel 27 and 26. Thy powers have broken thee into great water. The east wind has broken thee in the midst of the sea. Go read it in context for yourself. We find that the winds of Mother Nature, they do not dry up seas. What were these winds and how were they caused? And what was really implied here? Let's go back to Ezekiel 4:1 in the Smith and Goodspeed rendition of the Bible. I looked, and lo, there came from the north a violent gale or a wind, accompanied by a great cloud, with fire flashing through it, and a radiance around about it, while out of the midst of it it gleamed as something with a luster like that of shiny metal. How can anybody refute that? Jeremiah 23:19, Smith and Goodspeed. Jeremiah speaking, see, the storm of the Yahweh has gone out in fury, a sweeping storm that whirl over the heads of the wicked. Verse 20, the anger of the Lord will not turn back until he has fully accomplished this design of his mind at the end of the days, and you shall perfectly understand it. Jeremiah 25 and 32, thus saith the Lord of hosts, behold, evil shall go forth from nation to nation, and a great tempest, meaning the wind, shall rise, whirling from the uttermost parts of the earth. No nation is going to be left out. And to quote, these are the extraterrestrials invading on mankind's behalf, the children of Israel. We find Jeremiah 25 and 33, and the slain of Yahweh shall be in that day from one end of the earth even unto the other end of the earth, and they shall not be lamented or gathered or buried. The dead body shall be like dung on the ground. A point is that when the king of Nineveh heard the words of the Yahweh God of Israel delivered by Jonah, they repented from their sins and their false religion or their apostasy, whatever they were doing wrong. He and his people were spared. They were saved. And the Greek word for tempest, according to Strong's Concordance, is lilapis, pronounced lilaps, meaning a whirlwind storm like a turning UFO. Matthew 8:24, and behold, there arose a great tempest in the sea, so much that the ship was covered with the waves, but he, Christ, was asleep. Later on, we're going to discuss these parallels, and I think you're going to find some really exciting ancient accounts of these extraterrestrial lords intervening into the lives of the earthmen. Was he trying to show them the connection with Jonah? Was he trying to show them that he was the king of angels and extraterrestrials, or who he really was? Job 9 and 6, which shaketh the earth out of her place, and the pillars thereof tremble, which commandeth the sun, and it rise not, and sealeth up the stars, which alone approach out of the heavens, and treads upon the waves of the sea. So as far as I know, Christ was the only one that ever walked upon the sea. He spoke and the waves stopped and the sea was calm. Was he speaking to extraterrestrials that created the tempest? Yes, we believe so. We explained that idiom of walked, which really applied something else. We'll prove it in another chapter. Psalms 11 and 6. Upon the wicked shall rise snares and fire and brimstone and horrible tempests. His legions of extraterrestrials and their ships, they create these conditions. So after Jonah was thrown overboard, the storm or the tempest, it stopped as Jonah said it would. Jonah 1 and 2 from the Fenton, he answered, heave me up and fling me into the sea, and the sea shall be abated upon you, because I know that this great hurricane has been brought upon you on my account, due to his disobedience. Everyone who's read any UFO books or different sightings and are familiar with these reports of the UFOs going into the lakes and the seas all over the world down through the centuries, and it's almost, you'll find in the back page of some of the smaller papers, it's almost a weekly occurrence. So we find that they threw Jonah overboard, and they asked that the ever-living lay not his innocent blood on them, and they vowed vows, and etc. Here it is this is where it gets interesting. We find that the Friar Fenton footnotes, it shows the misused word whale or fish. Jonah in 2:6, great fish. Now we're quoting from Fenton. Jonah 2:6, great fish was the name of the ship, mistranslated whale in the version of the Greek translators, whose blunder has been repeated by all subsequent translators in all language to the perplexity of the readers. Now, he goes on to say, until I decide to go back to the original statement of the prophet in his own Hebrew, end of quote. Fenton, he was a man who spent over 50 years of his life to where he could read the most ancient of the manuscripts in their language like we could read a newspaper. I think he was a very thorough man, a very dedicated man, what you would call a godly man. For many years I thought that the great ship then was a sailing ship, but then I thought, how did it pick him off the bottom of the sea? Thank God for Friar Fenton showing us that it was a ship and sailing, one that sails in the wind over the earth. It was a sailing ship of the, let's say, if it was a sailing ship of the old earth type, how then did it get Jonah off the bottom of the sea? We get out of one frying pan into another, so it would appear. And then we find that as we read the report, he was tangled in seaweed at a great depth. Some translators said he went down past the top of the mountains. Now we realize they didn't have any hard hat divers or scuba divers. No, but there is irrefutable evidence that there was a great ship that could go under the water and could rescue him from watery grave. And we find that Christendom doesn't have any idea, I don't believe, in the fullest extent, why they're baptized in water. Didn't the disciples understand the real story of Jonah being rescued from this watery grave that we spoke of? We find here that Jonah, he tells us his soul did fail him for 3 days, and he laid in the hole or the belly of the great ship. So we see that Christ laying dead in the hollow of this big earth rock that was carved out from a solid rock into a tomb. And we find that baptize in Greek, it means to make fully wet or submerged. We get this from the word baptismo. We find in 1 Corinthians 10 and 2, the King James, it talks about all the children of Israel were baptized under the cloud or a great spaceship. All were baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. In other words, they had their lives saved from Egypt and old Pharaoh as the Red Sea was parted by the great extraterrestrial intervention. And again, their lives were restored and saved by the water brought in by the great water ships of the Most High. Later on, we have to confess to you at this time we're taking some things out of context from other chapters, but what you'll have to do is try to bear with us and wade through it, and I think that you'll understand as we get into the subject of the great extraterrestrial ships that brought them food and substance rather than just some sticky stuff that fell out of the sky and they scraped it off the stones. This is some more erroneous teachings and mistranslations of the ancient transcribers. But now we're going to get into a little area here that we may lose some of you, and you may not agree with it. But just bear with me as I cite a few scriptures in the good book. You can skip this, but hang on, then we'll get something you may enjoy more. Later on, we find that the one they call Yeshua the Christ, that many believe was Yahweh incarnate, which they believe was corrupted by the translators to the present-day term Jesus. We find Isaiah 48:8 and Jeremiah 32:2, reading to you from the Sacred Name Bible, I am Yahweh, that is my name, my glory and honor. I will not give, nor my praise to images. Exodus 3:15, still quoting from the Sacred Name Bible. Yahweh said, this is my name forever. Isaiah 52:6, Yahweh said, my people shall know my name. Proverbs 30:4, what is his name, and what is his son's name, if thou canst tell? We could give you hundreds of scriptures proving the corruption of the sacred name, but we'll spare the reader. That is not the subject of this chapter, only to prove the next verses of 1 Colossians 10:4. And did all drink the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and it says, and that rock was Christ. So was in a rocket or a type of extraterrestrial ship, then I might be able to buy that, because it's not until the New Testament that the Messiah that Christendom claims was born. So now we see Yahweh was Yahshua incarnate, and the word spiritual has long confused Christendom as it's used in the foregoing. We find Strong's Concordance, they cite to us that the word here was from the 4152, if you care to look it up. It was pronounced pyromatikos. They leave out the fact it is from this that we get a wind-like flight. The same thing that comes in the wind or the air like something flying, not carnal or earthly resonant, not humanly but ethereal. This is what they're saying. As then they do, they're fair as from the sky, divinely brought, what they call supernatural. That's the word we use when we can't explain things, so it's supernatural, it's mystical, and your priest or preacher may say, my son, this is one of the great unknowns. They always use this when they don't have a explanation as from out of the universe, extraterrestrial intervention, as in this case. Now we go to another problem. Remember, Christ was called a fisher of men. Was Jonah the first catch of this Messiah? Hang on now, Jonah 2:1 for our Fenton. But the ever-living had appointed the great fish, not small but great, to pick up Jonah, and Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the hole, not the belly of the fish. And Jonah prayed to the ever-living God from the hole of the fish, and this ship was called the fish. In another chapter, we show how Ezekiel's ships had mechanical arms. Keep that in mind, how it'd be possible for him to pick him up and put him inside or in the hold of this extraterrestrial ship. Here the reader is saying, all of this makes sense, but what about the ship being called or named the great fish? That's what Jonah called it. We will deal with several confusing scriptures. It'll become simple in the light of a little reasoning. Let's go back to World War II in a minute, and the American planes and their squadron symbols that showed where they're from and who they were with, and were sometimes named after states and etc. For example, the famous plane that first crossed the ocean called the Spirit of St. Louis. Now, if it is true that Satan has ships, or those that are diametrically opposed to this great Lord of space of the children of Israel, he had his emblems on his ships also, the dragon and the serpent. For emblems, we've proved in chapters that we'll be dealing with in the near future here, called the dragon ships of China. And we know that the Germans, Japanese, French, and Americans, they all had their different signs so that they might identify one another from those of the enemies. Why not the ever-living ships? Please turn your tape over to side 2. As I believe that we've proved what cherubims really were, that they were not naked baby angels on such things as church windows and podiums, we find it in reality that they were extraterrestrial spaceships. But Bible scholars and students have not understood Ezekiel's spaceships because of their squadron markings. Possibly identifying the path to or the areas of the universe, all using astronomical signs as used throughout the Bible, still used in astronomy today, all telling a story of the grand scheme of the Creator and some yet to be fulfilled. Please understand now that I'm not promoting astrology, but astronomy. We say in another chapter, Bullinger was a great student. He tried to make Christendom aware of the stars and their symbols, which is proved in the Bible, as we quote from Revelations, the 4th chapter, 6th and 7th verse. People for centuries have not understood the word mount and holy city and New Jerusalem because they didn't understand the mount as something that flies because of the symbols surrounding the ever-living ship that they thought was surrounded by these strange, mythical, ethereal, spiritual monsters like the Almighty has to sit there and consult his booger man. Well, it's absurd to say the least. As we turn the zodiac back westward through 60 degrees, we find 4 bright stars: Aldebaran, Antares, Regulus, Pho-Alahat, almost exactly in the same places assigned to them by the ancient Persians. Now, since the zodiac has slipped through 60 degrees in about 5,000 years, we can tell approximately where these observations of these ancient peoples were made. It was interesting to note that the 4 bright stars that the Persians and the Chinese alike said were in the 4 cardinal points of the zodiac. Now in the constellation of Taurus, meaning the bull, and Scorpio, called by Abraham the eagle. See, these signs and degrees and their interpretation varied from civilization to civilization. Now we find that Leo the lion, Aquarius, the man pouring the water out of the pitcher respectively, that these corresponded perfectly with the 4 faces of the cherubim of the book of Ezekiel and were the emblems of the 4 brigades, Judah, Ephraim, Reuben, Dan, and Israel, and the 4 square wilderness camp. So this is from whence we get the idea that these were emblems that went on the sides of the ship to identify them from, as we find the Almighty speaks about bringing them from the 4 corners of heaven. Let us go to Ezekiel 1 and 10. And as for the 4 likeness of their faces, the cherubims, they had the face of a man, they had the face of a lion on the right side. They 4 had the face of an oxen on the left side. They 4 had the face of an eagle. So it seems that they put these brigade symbols, as we'll call them, all around the side of their ships. So from any angle they could all identify, though they were from different parts, they all still knew that they were of, let's say, the same great fleet of space. Revelations 4, 6, and 7 goes into, and around about the throne the 4 living creatures full of eyes before and behind. And we have to understand that the ancient translators, they used the word living. They didn't know what type of engine or what it was that motivated these things. They couldn't identify. They'd never seen before. So they defined them as creatures when they said full of eyes before and behind. In other words, they say all the way around. They had these portholes. They had these things that the occupants of that vessel could look out of. Now continuing our quote, the first creature was like a lion, the second creature was like a calf, the third creature had the face of a man, and the 4th creature was like a flying eagle. Ezekiel 1, 19 and 19, for their rims they were high and dreadful, and they 4 had the rims full of eyes round about. When the living creatures went, the wheels of the smaller ships went behind them. When the living creatures, or atomic powered, were lifted up from the earth, it tells us that the wheels were lifted up. Ezekiel 10th chapter 12th verse, and the whole body and their backs and their hands and their wings and their wheels were full of eyes round about, even the wheels that they 4 had. So we find it is quite obvious that the writers of these ancient passages were referring to the signs of the zodiac as they appeared approximately 5,000 years ago, when we find that these four bright stars associated with the bull, the eagle, and the lion, the man, were situated in the very vernal equinox, as it's called, the autumn equinox and the winter solstice and the summer solstice, and according to the Chinese legends, kept watch over all of the others. These ships that came from the four corners of the universe, and their emblems, once again, I have to say, they represented where they came from. Now, did the ship that picked up Jonah, did it have the emblem of a fish? Anybody that studied astronomy, they look out there and they see the emblem of the fish. And it shows its universal location. Remember, they're both clean and unclean fish. And we find that Christ told his men not only where to fish, that he was to look among the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and some of the fish going back, as we're told in the old Hebrew Levitical laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which means the second telling, that there were some fish like catfish they were not to eat. They were bottom feeders. They're unclean. Throw them back. Now we go to a sign that is used in the heaven. It's called Picus or Picus Australis, and it is defined as the southern fish. It consists of 23 stars, one of the five and the fourth, and the etc., and the great fish that receives the flowing water from the urn of this water bear. It is known as the southern fish. It is brilliant. It is of the first magnitude and was a subject of much interest by the ancient Egyptians. In the zodiac of Dendra, we find the sign was called R, meaning a stream. It has two A's, A-A-R. Now, did we call, or did he, Jonah, that we're referring to, did he call the great ship that sails through the air the great fish because of its squadron emblem? Was it known in the ruins of Nineveh that they found statues depicting the sun god, also statues from Egypt depicting people from Cush, who were the black race? They proved that there was a mixed multitude of races in the land of Nineveh who came from all over the known world at that time, and they were there with the Israelites. Now, let's go for a moment to Jonah's prayer, found in the Farrar Fenton Bible, and it gives us some clues and things we might wonder about and speculate on. And he goes on, he said, "In my misery I cried to the Lord, and he pitied in the hollow den." Does not say belly, the hollow den. He was in something that was hollow, and it was very large. And he said, "And I cried, and he answered my cry. I was flung into the deep, in the heart of the sea, when your breakers and torrents round about, and your gallopers rolling on me. Then I said, I am thrown from your sight. Yet your holy name I will think. The water sucked me down to the soul of the deep. My head was entangled in weeds," meaning like seaweed, I imagine. "I sank to the clefts in the hiss," as it was called in the ancient days. He said, now this is a strange thing. It says, "The earth closed and barred me forever." Now, how does a whale or a super catfish get you out of a dilemma like that? Now, quoting again from his prayer, "But you brought my soul up from the pit." They couldn't use the word hell there, although I believe, off the top of my head, I think King James does, but the pit, it means the grave. And he goes on to cry, "My Lord God, when my breath fainted, I thought of the Lord. My prayer went up to your holy abode." Later we prove throughout all of our tape talks, we give you the exact location of this holy abode. I believe we can give evidence that's irrefutable, but we leave that to you to decide. Those who trust in vain falsehood, Jonah's prayer continues to say, abandon their hope. But I sacrificed praise with my voice. I vowed I will pay to the Lord. In other words, he's saying, okay, I'm going to do it right this time. Give me another shot at it. This old boy got his ball of twine together. Note the key words. Went to the heart of the sea, deep, flung into the deep waters. From the description we have his prayer. In order to be picked up from the ship, somebody had to go underwater. Now, regular sailing ships of those days, as I said before, they didn't have diving bells. They didn't have hard hat divers. I think it would be kind of silly for us to believe that some super catfish barfed him up on the beach. Now, I don't limit the Almighty. He can do anything that makes him grin. But in past chapters, we've shown that all along he worked with other prophets in a most scientific way. He was not running a magic show. Now, why should he change now? Now, why was Christ using the sign of Jonah? He spent 3 days in the grave like Jonah. When he was resurrected, he also resurrected other people with him. I believe from A to Z. That's Adam to Zechariah. Now, but with this is another chapter, another story. Do you get the picture? Some guy looking like a drowned rat showing up in the city without any luggage or a change of clothes, and requesting an audience with the king and saying he was a prophet of this Yahweh God. Of course, they were all swingers and opposed to Yahweh's law. Or did he walk 50 miles from town with the beach with seaweed hanging off of him? Now, let's look at it from another angle. If, as I believe I'm going to prove here, archaeologically, historically, chronologically, and biblically, let's suppose now, bear with me, I'm getting ahead of my story, but if a super spaceship buzzed the town and landed in the old city square to let him out, I bet that would get their attention. Well, the Farrar Fenton, Jonah 2:10, it tells us the ever-living afterwards directed the fish, and it discharged Jonah on the land. There will still be people who want to believe that a whale or catfish barfed him on the beach. That's their prerogative, but he told them that he was on his own. To hitch a ride in town? No, I don't think so. But it is plain to me that Jonah 10 and 2 should read thusly in the modern English. By the way, Nineveh was 50 miles inland, and then after you got there, it was 3 days walk across town. We find that the ever-living, after Jonah was brought back to life, regained his wits, he directed his pilot to circle the city and land the ship called the Great Fish. He put the steps down there so Jonah could get out of the ship. It kind of puts you in mind of another old boy named Jacob who saw the angels or messengers ascending and descending on the ladders of their ship as they would return, come and go from space. And now it goes on to claim that this city that was 3 days across while walking, he walked across the city warning the people all 3 days, telling them that they were going to be overthrown on the 4th day. Why would you believe the rantings of Jonah unless they saw a great ship or something that scared just the living hell out of them? That's what the religious world says, that we're full of hell. The ever-living will still cruise in the area, I believe, and he saw that they declared a fast and they repented and they called it off. Jonah in 3:10 to Farrar Fenton, God saw their acts and how they turned from their bad course, so God showed mercy instead of punishment, which he had warned would be afflicted upon all them, and they did it not. Now, let us continue on. If this saucer had landed and a dude got out of it in one of our cities saying if you don't turn, you're going to burn, I bet they'd get to religion. No, maybe not. I think we have a lot of calluses on our brains today. Can we expect a repeat of this in the 21st century? Does the Almighty know what's going on? I'm afraid that he does, and can we pity the people? Jonah didn't. He was hacked off because the Almighty didn't snuff him. If all this sounds far-fetched, after writing this quite some time ago, and having lectured on this in different areas, I came across a historical archaeological bit of evidence that would seem to bear out my apparent far-fetched discovery of what went on with Jonah and Nineveh. We would like to quote the evidence from a few years back, Ur, Ashur, and Babylon, by a man by the name of Schmoekel, in case any of you may not understand my pronunciation of it. You want to go to libraries and trace it down, look it up for yourself. It was translated as followed. An excavation in Nineveh, there was discovered in the library of King Ashurbanipal clay tablets on which it is described a voyage to the sky. It narrates how King Etan, later on we have to keep this in mind, we're going to deal with Etan as he is described throughout the Chaldean account of the flood and etc. It goes on to say, who lived about 5,000 years ago, also called the Good King, was taken as an honored guest on a flying ship in the form of a shield which landed in a square behind the royal palace, rotating, surrounded by a vortex of flames. From the flying ship it alighted tall, blond men with dark complexions, dressed in white, handsome as gods, who invited King Etan, somewhat dissuaded by his own advisers, to go for a trip in this flying ship. In the middle of a whirlwind of flames and smoke, he went so high that the earth with its seas and islands and continents appeared to him like a loaf in a basket. Then they disappeared from sight. King Etan in the flying ship, he reached the moon, Mars, and Venus. And after 2 weeks' absence, when they were already preparing a new succession to the throne, believing that the gods had carried him off with them, the flying ship glided over the city, touched down, and was surrounded by a ring of fire. The fire abated, and King Etan ascended, or descended rather, with some of these blond men who stayed as his guest for some days. Later on, as we get into the account of Gilgamesh, we will read almost the same account as the experience of this called Good King Etan. This sounds like a repeat of the performances of Moses and Aaron and Ezekiel and many others that we're going to go into as soon as we have acquainted you to the language and what these words actually said that have been perverted. Remember that King Etan said about Venus, the moon, and Mars, and we will cover this in more detail in later chapters. But keep this in mind about Venus and the moon and the Mars when we get to a chapter later on that we entitle The Venetian Wars, where the people of these planets were until a great war took place. I think we have such a preponderance of evidence to prove all of this. Now we find that it was at this point I thought that I would probably end my lectures, and I used to, about Jonah. But as always, I had a demand from the audience who challenged me. He said, allow me to philosophize for a moment. Like Lord Byron said, I wish he would explain his explanation. That's understandable because we all have a problem with new truth when it's revealed to us. For the first time, our brain is like a sophisticated, or probably the most sophisticated in all the universe. It's been programmed with a lot of error throughout our lives, like our present-day computers that's used by our government and large and small corporations. And we all know by experience, as even through the news media, that there'll be what they call a hacker. Either intentionally or unintentionally, he will feed gobbledygook or information into the system called a virus. It disrupts the whole system, sometimes coast to coast. And are we not like that in our denominationalism and in our scientific knowledge, that we have had our computer disrupted by a virus? So this is what's happened to our mind, the most sophisticated computers. We all have kinds of viruses of misinformation laying within our consciousness or subconscious mind. So after a while, we're so loaded down with this misinformation, when truth comes along, we reject it based on the misinformation that we already have. As I've said on many occasions, there's people who say my mind's made up. Please don't confuse me with the facts. There's another one that a man they called a prophet by the name of William Bryan Branham said many years ago, there's three type of people in our churches today. We have believers, unbelievers, and then we have some make-believers. Or in some cases we find that our computer, it just says, it just shuts down on us, and we say does not compute. But then we have some people who desire and whose whose curiosity is stronger than their little injured ego. Remember, there's a possibility that new truth does not does and will compute. So they feed it in and they call it up to their computer screen, what I call your conscious mind, and later on, maybe just one passage at a time, and they'll be fair with themselves. They'll give it an honest evaluation. We cannot take air out of the human mind as we can with computers. It's there until the day we die. All we can hope to do is try to feed real truth in until the air becomes so weighed down that it'll never rise to our conscious mind again. But we should learn by our mistakes and our past and errors and have mercy on the next guy when he or she would give us a challenge of our new ideas. I used to argue with my teachers in life because I was interested in truth. And if I couldn't break down the evidence that I was receiving, but if I could, then I would receive it with great joy, and I had something that could stand the test of time and be giving new meaning to my life. So now let's go back to the man who challenged me and asked me about the gourd and the worm that killed it. We find this account in the book of Jonah, and I thought that it was unimportant, be quite frank with you. I wanted to keep my talk shorter, so I just ignored it. Well, I have to confess, I was taken back for a moment, and I didn't plan to make Jonah my entire life study. As I told a man, I felt it wasn't important to cover gourds, worms, and Jonah's fainting spells. But that night I got to thinking about the man's question and his confusion, and I decided that I owed him an answer to his honest, curious question. So it ate on me until I resolved to go back and research the Hebrew and the Chaldean. So instead of destroying my facts of a UFO being involved in Jonah's rescue and restoration and the ultimate conversion of this mighty nation and of a king and his great city of thousands of souls, I found to my pleasant surprise the fact is that I looked up that there was more than one UFO, if you will, a great event, a scenario there that had been played out that I didn't see the entire scope and picture of it myself. So after this great ship got the attention of the king and the city, Jonah was still a doubting Thomas, and he put an egg in his shoe and he beat it out of town to a hillside to watch from a safe distance, to watch them get it just like Sodom and Gomorrah. He must have assumed that even God couldn't convert all those sinners as he had been converted from his mistake. So to speak, we have Jonah like a lot of self-righteous people thinking, mercy, I'm all prayed up and paid up and I'm ready to go up and they're not going to turn, so they're going to burn. Maybe if he was aware of the scripture, my word shall not return unto me void, he would have had a different attitude. If he had only one thought, if there's the reason the Almighty sent me, then he surely he knows how to get these people to clean up their act and get their ball of twine together. So like a lot of folks who go to a stock car race, rather than see a winner, they want to see a fiery wreck. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the beastie called the mortal earth man. So let us return back for a moment to the book of Jonah, chapter 4, 5, and 6. We'll read from the King James Version. So Jonah went out of the city and sat on the east side of the city, and there he made himself a booth, and he sat under it in the shadow, or the shade, see, till he might see what would become of the city. But then it goes on to say in the 6th verse, and the Lord God prepared a gourd and made it come up over Jonah. Notice, come up over him. Now, I don't visualize him sitting there playing a flute like some snake charmer. Takes the lid off the basket, and here comes a giant serpent out. But it tells about this gourd, this mysterious thing. It might be a shadow over his head to deliver him from his grief. So Jonah was exceedingly glad of the gourd. That seems a contradiction. He already built a booth. It said he sat in the shadow of it, and he had shade, but then apparently the Almighty wasn't looking, so he had a magic gourd grow over his head. But anyway, let's reason that out for a moment. Keep in mind, this book of Jonah has been through many translations. As it's translated from one to the other each time, it loses a lot because they possibly couldn't find the equivocal word in the next language. They went from the Hebrew to the Greek, and then the first printed, mass-produced Bible was the German Bible, and then it went into the English. And then the translators feared the king and the priesthood, who might be offended and charge them with heresy, and he might become the guest at ye old barbecue and the town squares. Many times they knew what they read, but they had nothing to compare it with in their age, so flying saucers didn't compute. So it must be a round gourd. So then the real story gets balled up. But luckily we still have the concordances that shows us the multiple choice of words, and we in this enlightened age, we can correct these areas of error that have been perpetrated on us for many centuries. So what made us suspicious or suspect chapter 4 and 5 and Jonah leaving the city, going to the east side of the town and making the booth some type of lean-to? Then it says he sat under it in the shadow of the shade of it. Then verse 6, if we would take it literally, the Lord wasn't paying attention to the fact that Jonah already had shade, so he plants this mysterious, like Jack and the Beanstalk that we find in the fairy tales there, to give him shade. But if we question what we read, it tells us something that comes up over Jonah. It says he prepared a gourd, like he said he prepared a fish, and we learned this was a ship. Prepared seems like an insignificant, nondescript little word, but it might be worthy of consideration. Yet in Jonah 1:17 he said he prepared a great fish. Jonah 4:6 the Lord prepared a gourd. 4:7 he prepared a worm to eat the gourd. And 4:8 he prepared a vehement east wind. So wait a minute, did this gourd cause the wind? Well, if you get a concordance or a lexicon, you'll find there's dozens of places in the Bible the word prepared is used, but never as it is in the original language as in Jonah's testimony. The word in the Hebrew is pronounced mana, a prime root to weigh out by implying a lot or constitute officially. Also to enumerate or enroll, appoint, count, number, prepare, set, or tell. He told somebody. I don't think God's sitting around talking to gourds, so it doesn't seem unreasonable to think that a great Lord of space spent all of his time sitting around talking to gourds and fish and worms, and then he's talking to the wind. Any one of us caught doing that, we'd end up in a padded cell and be seeing a talking doctor on a regular basis. So if you could put these, then they'd want to see if you put little blocks and round holes and squares. And then the mighty space Lord is a scientist. Let's keep that in mind. He uses scientific methods, not magic shows. So in the light of using this reasoning, it sounds like the Lord who gave the command in Hebrew, mana, officially told someone in a smaller ship to hover over Jonah's position and give him protection. So we'll learn that throughout these talks, under his shadow is an old Hebrew idiom, meaning he will be under the Lord's protection. We've all sang the song in church, hide me under the shadow of thy love. And I don't know about you, but I've drawn great comfort from it. But he goes on, and don't you think about this time Jonah was getting nervous in the service as he just told the king of the mightiest city on the face of the earth, who probably had a large army, if you don't turn, you're going to burn. Now, many of you are probably wondering, what did the gourd symbolize? Strong's Concordance said the original word, and they use a question mark because it kind of busts their bubble. But the word was ki kayan. They said probably from kaya, a prime word to vomit or spew. Now, how do you get barf, vomit from a gourd? There's no similarity, and they don't compute. But if we move along, it seems that transcribers did it again and changed the scientists around on us, or the science, I mean to say. But the clue is something that made Jonah sick. I was very suspicious that it was from too many rads, as they call it, of radiation, what were emanating from the this ship that has been charged to look over him. It was over his head for protection. It caused a shadow. And we're going to learn about this in a chapter that we call St. Paul's Radiation Burns. And we prove both Paul and a modern account of two women, and also equating it to our Old Testament on another account. But we find the word shadow in the Hebrew is to sail. It comes from the word shade, whether literally or figuratively, and then they say the main word, it means defense. So whatever was shadowing over him, this mistranslated word gourd, it had been issued to go forth to him by a command from this almighty space Lord and give him defense. Then they refer us, as they're not sure, from tasala, means to hover over like helicopters. Strong's Concordance says this ties in with another word. Sounds very similar to sala, means to tumble down like a frisbee, settle by a waving motion, sink, like we find it already sank into the ocean and got Jonah. And then they go on to say that tasal la also means, conveys the idea of vibrations, quiver, as a hovering craft. So, did not like all of these describing this word or action, the type of this extraterrestrial craft. Did it not tell of protection for this prophet? Why else did he need shade, as Jonah already had his own, as we pointed out before? If you look up the gourds in the plural, it changes. From going from the singular word gourd, you go to gourds, and it's entirely different meaning. It means like a wild cucumber. And as we find in many other chapters, we find these ships are described as a flying roll or something that looks like a cucumber. And then they refer you to read a word, teslem, pronounced teshlem. Actually, it's from an unused root. One so far they can't trace it. They're not sure where it came from, whether it's Chaldean, Hebrew, or who. And they can they can say it means like a phantom, a figure, an illusion, resembles, hence a representative like a round flying gourd or a cucumber. Now, some have translated a figure or an image, something they had nothing to compare it with, so they had to use this figure of speech. Zechariah, the 5th chapter, verses 1 and 2, it speaks of a ship that's described as a flying roll. With today, we've heard people speak of them as looking like a flying cigar, a dirigible, and I think that cucumber would also be comparable. Then I turned, I lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and I behold a flying roll. And he said to me, What seest thou? And I answered, I see a flying roll. The length thereof is 20 cubits, and the breadth thereof is 10 cubits. And we know that the most ancient sacred cubit, it was approximately 25 inches. And then he, Zechariah, in the 9th verse, tells of 2 women who came out of this flying roll, also called an ephah. And we can describe the small helicopter-type device, we'll cover this in other chapters, that they wore on their back. But there has been ancient carvings and statues that show such a device, including small, powerful things that can be nothing else than like batteries. And they operate this device. Maybe we can cover this later in other aspects in further detail in other talks, and maybe we can get out pictures and drawings of them. In verse 9, and we're still quoting from Zechariah, and he goes on to say, And I lifted up my eyes, and I looked, and behold, there came 2 women, and the wind was in their wings, for they had wings like the wings of a stork, and they lifted up the ephah between the heavens and the earth, or vice versa. In other words, they went back to him in it. Maybe one of our scientists will get an idea. We can have little one-man helicopters with batteries put on your back. Sure save fighting traffic, wouldn't it? Well, no, it resembled a gourd, so the translators must have thought it means a gourd, a smaller shuttle ship, like a small fighter version. Remember verse 5 chapter 4 said, He built himself a booth, and he set it under the shadow of it. So why was a gourd necessary? Let's be serious about this. If you look up the word gourd in the plural, it was presented that it refers you to the Hebrew word pakoah. P-A-K-K-O-O-A-W. The wild cucumber that splits open, sheds its seed like a gourd, but I see no bearing of one on the other, no comparison whatsoever. We find a mark here beside the gourd called the obelisk, showing a change by the British or sometimes American versions, and they revised the translation of what they thought, leaving us some mystery to search out in the light of the knowledge of this generation on our space flights and ships. So now we can see why Jonah became nauseous and he vomited. due to possibly excess radiation of this hovering craft, as we will show later, as I said, in St. Paul's writings. Then what about the worm? They gave several meanings as to what this word could possibly be. And the word was S-H-A-W-N-A-W, Shana. Is the only one that makes sense. It means to return. So he found himself unprotected without an extraterrestrial ship, and the protection it afforded him, and he did not understand. In the meantime, the folks in the city that repented from their sins, he was no longer needed. He didn't need the spaceship. So the Lord called back the protection of the prophet of the hovering craft that he had over him, and he called him back to the main ship by radio communication. Now you say that sounds kind of goofy. Well, if you can build a spaceship, you can build a radio. And wait till we get to King David's ham radio. That's another chapter where you go back and read it in the scripture. It's so plain that you can't refute it. So most likely it was best for Jonah, as we see he was getting sick from these too many rads of radiation, the point that he fainted. Back in verse 5 of the 4th chapter, Jonah wanted to die because, why? He was so sick. Verse 8 tells of a great wind being stirred up. Wasn't this caused by the great ship's departure? It must have blown his hut down, because he said he fainted in the sun. Well, we'll leave you to ponder that. As we implied, there are many different people from different nations in chapter 3 and 8. It says, let man and beast be covered with sackcloth and cry mightily unto God. Yea, let them turn away, every one from his evil way and from the violence that's in his hand. Now, the king commanded man and beast here alike to dress in sackcloth and cry mightily unto God. They surely didn't mean dress up your poodle dogs and jackasses and pray and bray together. We find nations of people in both in the Old and New Testament. They're referred to as beasts and sheep and goats and hogs and dogs and serpent people. We'll see later on Christ speaking to a woman and refers to her as a dog, which I believe we prove is one of the ancient descendants of Nineveh, who at one time worshipped Dagon. Her ancestors did, and they still retain that name. They were ancient black people who believed that they came from the dog star Sirius. More on this later. I think that you'll find this really exciting. Some mistranslated this and called her a beast or a Canaanite woman, as I believe both of those interpretations are wrong. She was an ancient descendant of the Dagon worshippers. We find Jonah, he was comparably, allegorically, a type, a shadow of the Christ that was to come, because remember, he was a sacrifice offered by his shipmates, and he volunteered, just like they say that the Christ of the New Testament did. We note in the center notes of the King James put out by the World Publishing Company, we find the word bowels as an alternative to belly. And it's also used in Jonah 1 and 17. It said, now the Lord prepared a great fish to swallow up Jonah. And Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. Now that's the King James Version. But Webster's dictionary, it says bowels used in the archaic language means the seat of piety, tenderness, or remote parts. Although Jonah was disobedient, the Almighty still sent a ship down to save him. We also have Christ refer back to Jonah as a type and a shadow and an allegory, as Jonah was the sacrifice also here. So it was pointing to his great sacrifice. Jonah was definitely taken inside of something in a place of safety. You might want to get it and read about it. A man cannot live that cannot breathe inside of a whale or a fish, and the translation of the Fenton Bible is virtually gives us a clue. Instead of belly or bowels, he said hold, as used on the inside of a ship. So I believe that we have covered the subject, but we might leave you with one last thought here, that for our Fenton version, that tells us afterwards, the ever-living afterwards directed the fish, and it discharged Jonah on the land. Doesn't say exactly where, but we thank you for listening. We We hope that you will contemplate these things and you will search them out for yourself and keep an open mind. And maybe as we get further down the road in our talks, this will become quite clear to you. Thank you, my friends, for listening.